I died the winter after my husband's funeral, in a rented room above a candlemaker's shop. Still wearing mourning black I could no longer afford to replace, and only in the last hour of my life did a frightened kitchen girl let slip that she'd seen Roland Fontaine very much alive in a Belcourt tavern 3 months after I buried him. I want to say that news broke my heart. It didn't. Not by then, my heart had already been spent, coin by coin on his debts. What broke in that final hour was something closer to disbelief. I had given up everything I owned to bury a man who hadn't died at all. So when I opened my eyes again in a bed with clean linen and strong lungs, 22 years old, 6 months married and 8 months away from the night his coffin would come home, I did not waste a single minute being grateful for the second chance before I started being useful with it. The last thing I'd felt in that rented room was cold. The last thing I heard was my own breath going shallow, the candlemaker's wife telling someone in the hall that the young widow upstairs wouldn't need feeding much longer. I remember thinking, with the strange clarity dying sometimes grants you, that I had spent my whole first life being good to people who had never once been good to me in return, and that this was apparently what it earned a woman: a cold room, a debt she hadn't incurred, and a husband alive and laughing somewhere warmer. I lay very still in my new old bed, in a house I recognized as Fontaine Manor, and let that fury settle into something I could actually use. The first thing I noticed once I trusted my own eyes was the coin. It sat on my dressing table exactly where I'd always kept it, a worn silver Vaillant crown, my father's wedding gift pressed into my palm the morning I left for Sir House for good. "Never spend your last coin on someone else's debt," he'd told me, folding my fingers over it. "Keep this one back, always, no matter how good the reason sounds for spending it." I had broken that promise within the first year of my marriage, quietly, one small concession at a time. The way you always break the promises that matter most. Not this time. I picked the coin up, felt its familiar worn edge, and made myself a second promise to go with my father's first one. I would not spend anything else of mine on the Fontaine family's debts. Not my dowry, not my patience, not my name. My brother Baptiste and my sister Margot arrived for a fortnight's visit not 2 months into this second chance at my marriage, exactly as they had in my first life, on the same road in the same battered family coach, complaining about the same ruts in the same stretch of muddy lane outside Claremont Vale. In my first life I remembered dreading that visit a little, already half trained to be embarrassed by how loudly my own family laughed at the Fontaine dinner table. This time I found myself standing at the gate before the coach had even properly stopped, grinning like a girl half my age. "You've gone soft in the country already," Baptiste said, climbing down and looking at me with open suspicion, the particular suspicion of an elder brother who has always been able to tell within a minute when something is wrong with you, even if he can't yet say what. "You're smiling like father does when a client's about to sign a bad loan." "I'm smiling because I've missed you," I said, which was true, though not the whole truth. Margot, 16 and entirely unconcerned with subtlety, hugged me hard enough to knock the breath half out of me before pulling back to study my face with the same frank assessment our father brought to a client's ledger. "You look different," she said. "Not ill, just different, like you've decided something." "I've decided the mutton here is dreadful, and you should both stay long enough to remind the kitchen what a decent stew tastes like," I said, and steered them both firmly toward the house before either could ask a second question I wasn't ready to answer. It was, in its own way, the hardest part of that whole long year, harder even than smiling at Camille Rousset across a dinner table. Sitting across from my own brother and sister, night after night of that fortnight, and saying nothing at all about what I already knew was coming. Baptiste would have ridden straight to Belcourt with his fists the moment I said the word mistress. Margot would have written it all in a letter home before supper, certain she was helping. I loved them both far too much to risk either kindness undoing a year of careful, patient work, so I let them believe instead that married life agreed with me, that Fontaine Manor's gardens were lovely in the autumn light, that my mother-in-law was merely reserved rather than calculating, and I watched Baptiste tease Roland about his poor head for cards over the dinner table without once letting my face show what I knew. about exactly how poor that head truly was, and precisely whose money had been covering the difference. "He's not so bad," Margot whispered to me on their last night, tucking herself against my shoulder the way she had since she was small enough to still need lifting onto a chair. "You're Roland, he's handsomer than father's clients at least." "He is that," I agreed, and did not tell her that handsome had never once, in either of my lives, been the quality worth marrying a man for. When their coach pulled away down the muddy lane 2 mornings later, I stood at the gate until it disappeared entirely, and let myself cry for exactly as long as it took the sound of the wheels to fade, grieving in advance for the year of careful lies I still had ahead of me before I could tell either of them the truth and mean it. Roland Fontaine was, in this life as in the last, a genuinely charming man, which I had learned the hard way was not remotely the same thing as a good one. He came to my rooms that first morning with flowers he hadn't grown and compliments he hadn't earned, and I found myself watching him the way my father had taught me to watch a client's ledger, for the places where the numbers looked a little too tidy, to be honest. "You're quiet this morning, wife," he said, settling into the chair across from my dressing table without asking. "Not unwell, I hope." "Perfectly well," I said. "I was only thinking about the household accounts." Something flickered behind his easy smile, there and gone so fast I would have missed it in my first life. I did not miss it now. "Lemoine handles the accounts," he said. "There's no need to trouble your pretty head over ledgers." In my first life I had let that sentence stand, had even felt faintly flattered by it. The way you can be flattered into your own erasure if no one ever shows you what it looks like from outside. In this life I only smiled the smile I'd learned from my father's clients when they were about to lose a negotiation and didn't yet know it. "My head isn't so pretty that it can't add a column of figures, husband," I said. "I grew up in a banking house. I find accounts restful. I'll look them over myself if it's all the same to you." "It is not, in fact, all the same to me," Roland said, and for one unguarded second I saw exactly how little he'd expected to have to say that twice. I did not press him further that morning. That was, I had already decided, going to be the whole shape of my strategy this time. Never press where pressing would only warn them. Let them believe the same soft, biddable Delphine still lived behind my eyes, while I quietly rebuilt myself into someone who could survive what was coming. My mother-in-law, the Dowager Vicomtesse Béatrice Fontaine, had never much liked me, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I represented a fact about her own house she preferred not to examine too closely, that the Fontaine name, 4 centuries of land and lineage, could no longer pay its own debts without new money married in from outside. My money, my father's bank's money. More precisely, though everyone in that house had long ago stopped bothering to distinguish between the two. "You look tired, Delphine," she said. The first time she received me properly in her private sitting room, her eyes moving over my face the way a buyer's eyes move over a horse she suspects has been drugged calm for the sale. "Married life doesn't agree with you." "Married life agrees with me perfectly, my lady," I said. "I've simply been reviewing the estate's accounts. There's rather a lot to review." Her hand paused over her teacup for exactly the length of one held breath. "Lamine manages the estate," she said, echoing her son so precisely I nearly laughed aloud. It isn't a young wife's place to trouble herself with such things. I was raised to believe a woman who can't read her own household's accounts will eventually be robbed by someone who can, I said pleasantly. "I'd rather not be that woman, my lady. I hope you understand." She did not answer that directly. She only looked at me for a long moment with an expression I couldn't quite name yet, though I would come to understand it, before the year was out, as the particular calculation of a woman deciding exactly how dangerous a new obstacle might prove to be. My chance to prove I meant what I'd said came sooner than I expected, and in front of considerably more witnesses than I'd have chosen for it myself. The autumn tenant rents came due that month, and Lemoine, the estate steward, presented the collected sums to Béatrice one evening in the manor's small receiving room, with half the household present to hear the reading, as was apparently the yearly custom. I had asked, mildly, whether I might see the tenant ledger alongside the total, the way my father's clerks always let a depositor check their own sums, and Lemoyne had handed it over with the faint, indulgent smile of a man humoring a child who was asked to hold the reins of a cart horse. It took me perhaps a quarter of an hour, sitting quietly by the fire while the rest of the room discussed the coming harvest, to find that 3 of the outlying farms had been recorded as paying a full season's rent in coin, when the ledger's own earlier pages showed those same 3 farms had, every year prior, paid partly in coin and partly in grain, a difference that happened to leave a rather convenient surplus of coin unaccounted for once the grain's true value was subtracted out. "Monsieur Lemoine," I said, when the numbers were read aloud for Béatrice's approval, "I wonder if you'd help me understand something. The Fournier farm, the Aubers and the Gillius. Last autumn they paid in coin and grain both, same as every year on record before that. This autumn the ledger shows coin only, and rather more of it than the coin portion alone ever came to previously. Did the harvest change that much, or did the arrangement?" The room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone present has just remembered they'd rather be somewhere else. Lemoyne's easy smile did not so much as flicker, though his hand, I noticed, went very still around his own ledger. "A clerical matter only, madam," he said. "Grain prices fluctuated. The tenants preferred to settle the difference in coin this year, for their own convenience." "How thoughtful of them," I said, "to prefer paying more than usual in a year when the harvest reports I've read describe it as merely middling. I'd be glad to have you walk me through the calculation properly, monsieur, whenever it's convenient. I do find figures restful, and I'd hate to trouble Mother with an error in her own household's accounts that turned out to be nothing at all." Beatrice's gaze moved between the two of us, weighing, I understood even then, not whether I was right, but how much it would cost her to let the discrepancy be examined properly in front of witnesses who might repeat it in the village. In the end, family pride won out over whatever arrangement she and Lemoyne had going with those 3 farms' true rents. "See that it's corrected, Lemoyne," she said coolly, not quite meeting my eyes. "We'll have no talk in Clermont Vale of the Fontaines shorting their own tenants." It was a small victory, 3 farms' worth of coin restored to ledgers that would, I strongly suspected, be quietly adjusted back to their old convenient error within the year. But it told me 2 things worth knowing. It told the household that the new Vicomtesse could read a column of figures as well as any clerk in her father's employ, which meant no one would again assume my questions came from idle curiosity rather than genuine understanding. And it told me, watching Lemoine's carefully blank face as he gathered his ledgers afterward, that whatever larger scheme he and Beatrice were building, they would not risk letting me anywhere near the true books again if they could help it. I would simply have to find another way in. I did not yet know it would be a careless letter from a Belcourt physician that finally opened that door. I met Camille Rousset for the first time at a family dinner 3 weeks into my second chance at this marriage, and I watched her charm an entire table with the same soft, wounded warmth I remembered from every single week of my first life, back when I had genuinely believed her a friend. She was introduced as a distant Fontaine cousin, fallen on hard times, taken in out of family kindness to serve as Beatrice's companion. She wore plain grey wool where everyone else wore silk, sat a little apart at every gathering, and laughed only when someone else laughed first, as though she'd trained herself out of taking up too much space in a room. It was, I understood now, an extraordinarily effective performance, and I had fallen for every beat of it the first time around. "You must find our little country dinners very dull after the capital," Camille said to me that evening, her voice pitched low and confiding, the voice of someone offering you her secrets so that you'll feel obliged to offer yours in return. "Not at all," I said. "I find the company here quite instructive." She smiled, missing the edge in it entirely or choosing to. Across the table, Roland's eyes found hers for exactly 1 heartbeat too long, and I remembered, with a cold clarity I hadn't possessed the first time, precisely what that particular glance had meant. I did not confront either of them that night. In my first life it had taken me 4 years to even suspect it, and by then I had already spent every ounce of trust I had left defending my own husband to my own family. This time, I only excused myself early, complaining of a headache no one bothered to doubt, and sat up late in my rooms with the household ledgers. Lemoyne had reluctantly surrendered, looking for the first small tidy lie in the numbers. It did not take long to find one. Roland's personal accounts, nominally separate from the estate's, showed a curious pattern. Regular withdrawals to a merchant house in Belcourt, the nearest port town. Always in round sums, always recorded under the vague heading sundry expenses. I had seen enough of my father's clients try to disguise a mistress's allowance as sundry expenses to recognize the shape of it immediately. I want to be honest about what I felt that night, because I think it matters more than any of the anger that came later. I felt first an old, familiar shame, the reflexive kind that had nothing to do with anything I'd actually done. Some small, well-trained part of me still wanted to ask what was wrong with me, why I hadn't been enough to keep a charming man faithful, as though faithfulness were a prize I'd failed to win rather than a basic decency he'd simply chosen not to offer. I let myself feel that for exactly as long as it took to finish the thought, and then I set it down. The way you set down a heavy parcel you've realized you were never actually required to carry. The truth, once I let myself see it plainly, was considerably simpler than any story about my own inadequacy. Roland Fontaine had married me for my father's money, and he intended, eventually, to leave me for a woman who made no such uncomfortable demands as expecting him to be honest. I did not yet know how he meant to manage the leaving. I would learn in time that faking his own death solved several problems for the Fontaines at once. It would trigger the mourning annuity written into my marriage settlement, a sum meant to support a grieving widow that Beatrice fully intended to redirect toward the estate's gambling debts and Roland's new life abroad. It would free Roland from the marriage, without the scandal of a divorce, which the family's remaining pride could not have survived. And it would leave me, a grieving widow with no proof of anything, exactly where a comfortable lie always leaves its victim. Too devastated to think clearly, and too ashamed of her own devastation to ask the right questions in time. I intended this time to ask the right questions considerably sooner. I did not tell my own family what I suspected, not at first. That was, I think, the hardest discipline of that entire year, harder even than smiling at Camille Rousser across a dinner table. My brother Baptiste would have ridden out to Fontaine Manor within the week, and settled things with his fists rather than his ledgers, and my father, for all his patience, would have withdrawn every penny of my settlement the moment he suspected fraud, which would have warned the Fontaines to cover their tracks rather than walk further into my trap. So I wrote to my family only ordinary letters, full of ordinary complaints about country society and my mother-in-law's opinions on needlework, and I kept the coin in my pocket, and I waited, and I watched, and I learned to read Roland Fontaine's easy lies the way my father had taught me to read a forged signature, not by staring at what was written, but by noticing what had been left out. The first real crack came from Lemoyne himself, the estate steward, though he never meant to give it to me. I had begun by then quietly reviewing the estate's correspondence along with its accounts, a habit Beatrice found tedious enough to stop supervising after the first few weeks. Among a stack of unremarkable tenant letters, I found a note in an unfamiliar hand addressed to Lemoyne, from a physician in Belcourt named Dr. Marcelin Faure, it referenced, obliquely, the arrangement discussed, and the fee agreed for services rendered upon the family's future need, with no further detail, the careful vagueness of two men who both understood exactly what they meant and preferred it stay unwritten. I copied the letter, word for word, into my own private book before returning the original precisely where I'd found it. That was the night I stopped merely watching and started, deliberately, building a case. Over the following months, I made myself smaller in exactly the ways that made the Fontaines careless. I asked no more pointed questions about the accounts, having already extracted what I needed. I let Beatrice believe her disapproval had successfully cowed me. I let Roland believe his charm still worked, laughing at his jokes a beat later than I once would have, letting him see me grow, by careful, deliberate degrees, more anxious and more isolated. Exactly the portrait of a young wife slowly losing her footing in a household that had never wanted her. It cost me something, performing that smallness again, even in the service of a plan. Some nights I sat alone with my father's coin turning over and over in my hand and had to remind myself, out loud in the empty room, that I was not actually disappearing. I was only letting them believe I was, which is a very different thing, though it can feel almost identical from the inside if you're not careful to keep the distinction clear in your own mind. I want to say something plainly here, because I think it's the truest thing I learned in either of my lives. Being good and being useful to people who do not love you are not the same virtue, no matter how alike they're dressed to look. I had spent my entire first marriage mistaking one for the other, certain that if I only gave enough, forgave enough, made myself convenient enough, I would eventually be loved for it. I was not, I was simply used until there was nothing left worth using, and then I was left to freeze in a rented room above a candlemaker's shop, while the man I'd married laughed in a warmer city with someone else's borrowed name on his lips. I did not intend to make that mistake twice, no matter how convincingly Roland Fontaine smiled at me across the breakfast table. That resolve was tested rather sooner than I would have liked, when I returned to my rooms one afternoon to find my private book had been moved. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing only its owner would ever notice. I had left it tucked beneath a stack of embroidery patterns in the bottom drawer of my writing desk, spine facing left exactly as I always left it. I found it spine facing right, the patterns disturbed just enough to suggest someone had lifted the whole stack rather than merely glanced beneath it. My first instinct, and I am not proud of it, was pure animal fear, cold enough to make my hands shake before I made them stop. If Lemoine or Beatrice had read even a page of what was written there, the whole quiet year of careful smallness would collapse before it had produced anything worth showing a magistrate. I made myself sit down at the desk and think it through properly, the way my father had taught me to think through a client's account, before deciding whether a discrepancy meant fraud or merely carelessness. The book itself recorded dates, sums and quotations, nothing that named Maitre Corbin, nothing that stated outright what I suspected, only the raw material a suspicious mind might use to build a case. If someone had found it, they would have found questions, not yet an accusation. That was, I decided, survivable, provided I moved quickly. I sent for my maid, a quiet girl named Solange who owed her position in my household rather than Beatrice, and asked her, as calmly as I could manage, who had been in my rooms that afternoon. "Only the Vicomtesse's own maid, madam, come to borrow a length of ribbon for her mistress's hair," Solange said. "She said you'd given leave for it before. I didn't think to stop her. I had given no such leave, though I did not say so to Solange, who had done nothing wrong beyond trusting a lie delivered with sufficient confidence. I understood, instead, exactly what had happened. Beatrice had grown curious enough about my quiet evenings with the household ledgers to send someone searching, and had found, I had to assume, at least enough to confirm I was reading rather more closely than a grieving young wife with nothing to hide typically bothered to. I moved the book that same evening sewn into the lining of a travelling case. Roland's family had no particular reason to open, and I made myself, for the following fortnight, almost unbearably dull. I embroidered, I complained prettily of headaches. I let Beatrice see me weep once, over nothing at all. A performance so convincing it frightened even me a little, remembering how easily the real version of those tears had once come. It worked. Whatever suspicion the search had raised in her seemed to settle, over those 2 careful weeks, back into her old comfortable certainty that I was exactly the soft, manageable thing she had always assumed a banker's daughter must secretly long to become, given a little patience and enough silk to be distracted with. I never again left that book anywhere Beatrice's household could reach it without my knowing, and I never again let myself believe, even for an afternoon, that being careful once was the same as being safe. Meanwhile, Camille Rosette's own greed did a good deal of my investigating for me, though she never once suspected it. She had grown, over those months, gradually less careful in front of me, the way people always do around someone they've decided poses no threat. She let slip, one afternoon over needlework, that she found country life at Fontaine Manor temporary, said with a small private smile that told me she expected a rather different life waiting somewhere ahead of her. She asked me once with studied casualness whether a widow's mourning period in Vaillant was truly a full year, or whether it could be shortened under certain circumstances, for a family eager to see its future secured. I answered her question accurately and without any visible reaction at all, and went straight to my private book afterward to record the date and the words exactly as she'd said them. She was, I understood by then, not merely Roland's mistress but an active party to the whole scheme, impatient for her own promised position once I was safely, tragically out of the way. Her impatience, as it turned out, would matter a great deal more than her charm. We had one conversation, Camille and I, that came closer to honesty than either of us likely intended, on an afternoon when the two of us found ourselves alone in the manor's small library, waiting out a sudden autumn rain. "You've changed since the spring," she said, not looking up from the book she wasn't really reading. "You used to ask after everyone's health so sweetly. Now you mostly just watch. I find watching teaches me a great deal more than asking ever did," I said. Something in her posture shifted, a fractional wariness, quickly smoothed away. "You're not unhappy here, are you, Delphine? I'd hate to think the family had made you unhappy." I considered, for a moment, exactly how much of the truth I could afford to let show. "I think," I said carefully, "that a woman can be perfectly comfortable in a house and still understand. Quite clearly that comfort was never actually built with her welfare in mind. I don't resent it, I only stopped mistaking it for kindness rather some time ago." Camille's eyes met mine then, properly, for the first time in either of our acquaintance, and for one unguarded instant I saw something almost like recognition there. One woman who had built her whole position on being useful to a family that would discard her the moment usefulness ran out, looking at another. I wondered briefly whether she understood how alike our positions actually were, whether some part of her recognized that she, too, was simply a comfortable arrangement for the Fontaines rather than a cherished one, and would be exactly as disposable as I was the moment her own usefulness ran its course. If she understood it, she gave no further sign. The rain eased, she returned to her book. I returned to my careful watching, and neither of us spoke of it again. I sought out my own ally that autumn carefully, the way you approach anything you cannot afford to have go wrong. Maître Julien Corbin was a king's advocate my father's bank had used for years on matters of trust and inheritance law, a precise, unhurried man who asked exactly the questions that mattered, and none that didn't. I wrote to him under the plain excuse of reviewing my own marriage settlement, a request no one in the Fontaine household thought suspicious enough to prevent. "You believe your husband intends to stage his own death," Corbin said, when I finally laid the whole matter before him in his Montrouge chambers, "in order to trigger the mourning annuity in your settlement and to free himself for a second life abroad with Miss Rousset." "I believe it," I said. "I have a physician's letter referencing an arrangement, a pattern of withdrawals that match no legitimate estate expense, and a woman who speaks of my mourning period as though she's already counting the months until it ends." "That is suggestive," Corbin said carefully, "but not yet proof a magistrate would act on. A forged death requires at minimum a body, a certificate, and a burial. You'll need to catch the fraud in the act of its execution, not merely in its planning." "Then I'll need to let it happen," I said slowly, understanding, even as I said it, exactly what that would cost me. "I'll need to let them believe the scheme has succeeded, long enough to gather what we need to prove it in front of a magistrate." Corbin studied me for a long moment, the way I imagine he studied every client about to attempt something considerably more dangerous than they yet understood. "That is a great deal to ask of yourself, madame," he said. "To bury a man you know is alive, and grieve convincingly enough that his own mother believes it." "I've already buried him once, believing it was real," I said. "I find I have rather a lot of practice at grief by now, Maître Corbin. What I've never had practice at is making it count for something." The coffin came home on a cold morning in early winter, exactly as I remembered it. 4 travel-stained men carrying it through the gate, a servant falling to his knees in the courtyard with a story about sudden fever on the road from the southern border. Beatrice swayed on cue, servants gasped on cue, someone dropped a lantern, and a maid began to sob before she'd even properly understood what she was sobbing about. I did not collapse before that coffin, though I let myself perform something close to it, enough to satisfy the watching household. Instead, once the theatre had run its course, I did the one thing my first life's grief had never let me do. "I want to see him," I said, quiet and perfectly steady, into the sudden silence that followed. "Before the lid is sealed, I want to see my husband's face." Beatrice's composure cracked for exactly 1 instant. "The physician has ordered the coffin sealed already, Delphine." The fever left him in no state for viewing. "It would only distress you further. I understand the physician's concern," I said. "I would still like Dr. Fora himself to explain it to me directly, and I would like my own family's physician present when he does, given the significant sum this household's mourning annuity represents. I trust that isn't an unreasonable request from a grieving wife." I watched, with a satisfaction I am not ashamed to admit, the particular flicker of panic that crossed both Beatrice's face and Lemoine's at the mention of an outside physician arriving to examine anything at all. They refused me in the end, exactly as I'd expected, citing propriety, citing my own fragile state, citing every soft excuse a grieving widow was supposed to accept without question. I accepted it, outwardly, with exactly the defeated grace they were braced for. Inwardly, their refusal itself became the clearest evidence yet, carefully noted in my private book that same night, in Maitre Corbin's careful legal hand as much as my own, a family unwilling, under any circumstance, to let an independent physician examine the body of the man they had just buried. I played the grieving widow for the better part of a year, and I want to tell you honestly that it was the hardest performance of either of my lives, harder than any single scene from the marriage that had actually killed me. I wore black. I meant this time. I declined invitations. I let my letters home grow thin and sad, exactly convincing enough that even my own mother wrote back urging me to consider, eventually, coming home to Vasseur House to properly recover. I did not go home. Going home would have ended the investigation before it was finished, and I had promised my father's coin, if not my father himself, that I would not spend anything else of mine on the Fontaine's behalf, including the years it would take to build a case Beatrice could talk her way out of. Instead, I stayed at Fontaine Manor as the sad, useful ghost of myself the family needed me to be, quietly gathering Lemoine's laundering records, Four's letters, and the increasingly careless correspondence Camille no longer bothered to hide from a widow she'd stopped considering a threat. Maitre Corbin built the legal case in Montgrage, patient and precise, while creditors, who had been quietly circling the Fontaine estate's genuine debts for years, grew louder and less patient with every season the mourning annuity failed to arrive to satisfy them, since Beatrice had in fact redirected most of that promised sum toward Roland's new life abroad rather than the debts it was meant to settle. Baptiste came to Fontaine Manor twice during that long mourning year, and both visits very nearly cost me everything I had built. The first time, he arrived unannounced, 3 months into my performance of grief, and found me thinner than he liked, paler than he liked, and considerably less inclined to argue with him than the sister he'd grown up with. He sat across from me in the Manor's cold receiving room, his jaw set in the particular way it had been set since we were children, whenever he'd decided some injustice needed correcting and was working out how large a fight he was prepared to start over it. "You're not eating," he said. "You're not writing home properly. Margaret cries about it. I want to know what's actually happening in this house, Delphine. And I want the truth, not the version you think will keep me calm." I wanted, more than almost anything in that entire year, to tell him. It would have been such a relief to simply say the words aloud to someone who loved me without calculation attached. I did not say them. I looked at my brother's furious, grieving face and reminded myself, silently, of every reason his fury would ruin a case that was not yet ready to survive it. "I'm grieving, Baptiste," I said instead, which was, in its own strange way, not entirely a lie. "It takes people differently. Give me time." "I don't trust this house," he said. "I never did trust it, even before the wedding. There's something wrong here beyond ordinary grief, and I mean to find out what, if you won't tell me. Please," I said, "and let something genuinely raw show through. Because the plainest truths are always the most convincing ones. Don't. Not yet, I promise you on Father's coin, that if I ever truly need you to burn this house down around my ears, You will be the very first person I send for. I am asking you to trust me a little longer instead." He left, in the end unsatisfied but unwilling to override a request made on our father's coin, which had always meant something particular between the two of us, since we were children trading small promises over it. I watched his coach disappear down the same muddy lane, and spent that whole night afterward wondering whether I had just made the gravest mistake of either of my lives, sending away the one person who might have kept me safe, in service of a plan that still might fail entirely. The second visit, some months later, was worse. Baptiste arrived having heard, through some banking connection of our father's, whispered rumour of Roland's gambling debts, and a merchant house in Belcourt that had extended the Vicomte considerably more credit than his estate could plausibly support. He came prepared this time, not merely to worry over me but to confront Roland directly, and it took every ounce of persuasion I possessed, along with a full private accounting of exactly how close I already was to proof, delivered in a single desperate midnight conversation in the manor's walled garden, to keep him from riding to Belcourt himself and warning the entire scheme into hiding before Maitre Corbin's case was ready. "You've been building this alone this whole time," he said, when I finally told him enough of the truth to make him stay his hand, though not yet all of it. His voice had gone very quiet, the quiet of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about his own sister. "Why didn't you send for me the moment you suspected?" "Because you'd have ended it before it could be proven," I said. "And a scheme half exposed only warns its makers to hide better next time. I needed you to trust me with the whole of it, Baptiste, not just the part that made you want to fight." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at me the way I imagine our father looked at a client he'd finally, properly learned to respect. "You've become someone I don't entirely recognize," he said at last. "I've become someone considerably harder to rob," I said. "I find I don't mind the trade, that in the end proved the final crack in the whole scheme. The Fontaine's creditors, tired of waiting, petitioned the Vaillant Chancery for a formal accounting of the estate, precisely the kind of public scrutiny Beatrice had spent a year trying to avoid. The public reckoning, when it finally came, took place not in a ballroom or a dinner hall but in the plain, high-windowed chamber of the Vaillant Chancery in Montrouge, before a royal magistrate and a room full of creditors, solicitors and family, exactly the audience Maitre Corbin had told me, from the very first meeting, we would eventually need. I stood before that magistrate in unmourning grey, no longer performing anything at all, and watched Beatrice's face when the doors opened and I walked in alive, unbroken, and entirely uninterested in collapsing for anyone's benefit ever again. "This is a fraud upon this court," she said, too loudly, before Corbin had even finished presenting the first document. "My son is dead. I buried him myself." Baptiste stood at the back of that chamber, having finally been told everything the week before, present at my own request rather than kept away, and I watched him hold himself very still through Beatrice's outburst, the stillness of a man honouring a promise he'd rather not be keeping. "Then I imagine," Corbin said mildly, "you'll have no objection to Dr. For confirming, under oath, whose body was actually placed in that coffin, since Madame here has spent the better part of a year requesting precisely that examination and being refused." Dr. Faure, faced with the physician's letter I had copied word for word a year before, along with the very real prospect of his own prosecution for fraud, chose, in the end, to save himself rather than the Fontaines. He confirmed, under oath, that the body buried as Roland Fontaine had in fact belonged to an unclaimed traveller who had died of genuine fever in a Belcourt inn, and that he had been paid through Lemoine to certify the death as the Vicomte's own. Lemoine, confronted with his own ledgers and correspondence, collapsed almost as quickly, offering what he clearly hoped would read as full cooperation in exchange for leniency, and confirmed the pattern of withdrawals to Belcourt, the funds redirected from my mourning annuity toward passage abroad, and Roland's continued, entirely undead presence in a rented house outside the port, where Camille Rouchesser had, by then, already joined him under an assumed name. Corbin read a portion of Camille's own correspondence into the record last, letters she had grown careless enough to entrust to the ordinary post once she believed herself safely beyond suspicion. full of impatient questions about exactly when Roland's mother intended to release the funds that would let them purchase a house properly in both their true names, and one particular line, read aloud into that hushed chamber, that I suspect Camille would have given a great deal to unwrite. I do grow tired of being a grieving widow's shadow, Roland. Tell your mother I did not agree to wait forever. A woman too rose back, who I later learned was a Belcourt merchant's wife with a grudge of her own against the Fontaine name, laughed once sharply, before catching herself. Beatrice did not confess. She stood very straight through the entire proceeding, and when the magistrate finally read his judgment, holding her personally liable alongside her absent son for the fraudulent annuity claim and the debts it had been meant to cover, she looked at me with an expression I finally understood completely. Not remorse, but the bitter arithmetic of a woman who had gambled her family's whole future on my staying quiet, and lost. You were supposed to grieve quietly and go home to your father, she said, low enough that only I could hear it, as the guards moved to escort her from the chamber. You were supposed to be a soft, sad, manageable thing. I was that once, I said. In a life you'll never remember, my lady. I grieved so quietly I nearly disappeared entirely, and it earned me nothing but a cold room and an empty coffin. I decided this time to be useful to myself instead. I find I prefer it considerably. The magistrate's judgment stripped the Fontaine estate of its remaining assets to satisfy both the mourning annuity fraud and the family's older gambling debts, restored my full dowry and trust to my own name under the annulment. Corbin had already prepared on grounds of fraud and desertion, and issued a warrant for Roland Fontaine's arrest, though by the time King's officers reached the rented house outside Belcourt, he and Camphil had already fled further south, leaving Lemoine and Beatrice to answer for debts that were, at last, entirely and unmistakably their own to carry. I never saw Roland again. I heard of him twice more in the following years, both times as rumour rather than fact. Once as a man selling a false title to a merchant's gullible daughter in a coastal town 2 kingdoms away, once as nothing at all, which felt, when the news reached me, like the truest ending he could have been given. I did not go looking for either confirmation. Some debts are not worth the coin it costs to collect them personally. I went home to Vasseur House that winter, not as a broken widow returning to be cared for, but as an unmarried woman of independent means with a very particular set of skills and an unusually thorough understanding of exactly how family fortunes get quietly stolen from the women who marry into them. My father met me at the door himself, which he almost never did, and held my face in both his hands for a long moment before he said anything at all. You did all this yourself, he said. It wasn't quite a question, with Maitre Corbin's law and your bank's numbers behind me, I said. But yes, myself, your grandmother always said the Vasseur women dream true, he said, echoing something I half remembered him saying in another life entirely, though I never told him that part. I begin to think she undersold you. I did not remarry, I want to be honest about that. Since I know it isn't always the ending this kind of story's expected to give a woman, and I have had more than one well-meaning acquaintance ask me gently whether I don't feel the lack of it. I don't, particularly. I had already given a great deal of my first life to the project of making myself lovable to someone who had never intended to love me honestly in return, and I found, once that project was finally completely finished, that I had considerably better uses for the rest of my time. I took a junior seat at my father's bank the following spring, the first woman ever to hold one. Over the quiet objections of 2 senior clerks who came around to the arrangement considerably faster once they saw how quickly I caught the small, tidy lies other clients tried to slip past careless eyes. Baptiste, who inherited the barony in time but never once resented sharing the bank's real work with me, used to joke that I could smell a forged signature from across a crowded room, which was not, strictly speaking, an exaggeration. I taught my sister Margot to read a ledger before she was 15, the way our father had once taught me, and I gave her on the morning she came of age a worn silver Vaillant crown of her very own, pressed into her palm with the same words I'd been given, and had finally, properly, learned to keep. Never spend your last coin on someone else's debt. I keep my own coin still, on the same dressing table where I found it the morning I woke up 22 again, with 8 months left to change everything. I take it out sometimes on quiet evenings and turn it over in my hand, feeling the warm place where 4 decades of Vasseur thumbs wore the crown's edge nearly smooth before it ever reached mine. I think, some nights, about the woman who died alone above a candlemaker's shop, still trying to be good enough to earn a love that was never actually for sale. I am sorry for her, the way you're sorry for someone else's daughter. I am not her any longer, and I have stopped waiting for anyone's permission to say so plainly. I spent my whole first life certain that my worth was a debt I owed to other people's approval, payable in endless small surrenders. I know better now. Whatever I am worth, I decided, somewhere between a forged death certificate and a cold chancery mourning, I get to keep it for myself. That, in the end, is the only inheritance I ever actually needed.